Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and we're in the second night near the conclusion of the Real News Webathon. Now joining us, I believe, from Atlanta. Danny, you're in Atlanta, aren't you? Okay, we got to do something with Danny's audio. Danny's audio is too low. Danny Glover joins us.
I can pump the audio.
There we go. Now we're good. Danny Glover, actor and activist, needs very little introduction. And also joining us is Adolph Reed. Adolph, where are you today?
I'm in Chicago at the moment.
Adolph Reed comes to us from Chicago. Adolph is the author of the book, let me get it in front of me, The Jesse Jackson Phenomena, The Crisis of Purpose in Afro-American Politics. He's also the editor of Race, Politics, and Culture. Thanks for joining us, both of you. Danny, kick us off here. The debate that's going on now in Congress on the Bush tax cuts and whether to extend them or not, it kind of seems to be a final breaking point of a lot of progressive politics. Even people in the House, progressive Democrats, House members are saying this is kind of a line in the sand. In terms of your own view of Obama, I know from the very beginning your support for Obama was one, critical support. You said we should all understand where he comes from. But how has your own thinking about Obama evolved from the primaries to now? Dan.
What is that now you said?
I'm asking about how your own thinking about Obama has evolved from the primaries to today.
Well, I can't say I'm disappointed. We're always saying, and many of us were saying that, a campaign for a presidency is not the building of a movement. And surely that we were wanting and hoping that we would engage beyond the election of Obama as a president in the building of a movement that would be critical of his policy, a movement that was not seduced by the fact that he had become the first African American person of color as president. The absence of that is what's disappointing to me. The absence of that movement is what's so disappointing, and in so many constructive ways, and so many specific ways, he's done exactly what all of us had anticipated. I anticipated that the role he would play would be essentially, as many have said, is to try to attempt to rescue the empire. And he's done simply that. Exactly. Now, that sounds generic or somewhat maybe perhaps sophomoric or whatever, but essentially the empire was in crisis. The paradigm, financial paradigm, capitalism is in crisis, and once we accept that and begin to organize, trying to find constructive alternatives to that, whatever we want to call it, whether we want to pull on our legacy of progressives and talk about socialism, or whether we want to talk about 21st century socialism, the one thing that we fail to do is to begin to exert the energy of new possibilities, and it's very interesting because I have some friends of mine who have been economists. I've done work. I'm on the board of CIPRA. I'm on the board of Yes Magazine, and these are men who've written, and in some cases, in the case of a couple of our friends, very, they tried to tell it like it is. But it seems as that in the midst of that, Obama was going to have them at the table. I remember a group of thinkers, quote unquote, progressive thinkers, got together and offer the possibility, suggestions of what might look like the agenda for a new economy. But they weren't even at the table. They weren't even invited to the table.
Well, that was clear. There was a clear at the table at the healthcare.
And who was at the table of the healthcare? All of these particular issues that we find, and the disappointing point is that the movement that needs to happen, the movement that needs to be built for specific systemic change has not been evolved.
Right. Adolph, I was at Morgan State University in Baltimore a few weeks ago, It's a mostly black university. The class
Right.
I spoke to was about 99% black. And it was interesting. A young woman in the class asked the question. She says, can they do anything to you if you don't vote? And the teacher was kind of a little upset, and he said, well, what do you mean by that? And various students said, well, we're thinking we actually just want to decide not to vote in these midterm elections as a real decision, but is there any repercussions? But it was like the whole class was kind of shaking its head. Is this actually something that's unusual happening on the university, or is this disillusionment with Obama spreading amongst the African American community?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, though, I will say that when I was in graduate school, my dream job was to be at Morgan State, so I know the campus pretty well. But look, I can understand the frustration, but I think the problem is that what's happening. One of the things that's happened over the last 30 years or so, to just kind of underscore the point that Danny makes, is that our notion of political activism, has been shriveled down basically to voting, which is the most passive form of political expression that there is. And I think this is one of the contradictions in the Obama campaign from the very beginning, and in the crafting of brand Obama. I mean, going back to
Adolph, we're having a little trouble with the audio. I think maybe if you turn your speaker off while you talk, it might help. I think we're getting feedback from your machine.
It can be. I don't have a speaker on. All I've got is my...
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there's something with the Skype then. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I guess I was going to say, I don't know what you lost or what you got, but the problem, or one of the contradictions in the campaign, or problems about the campaign, or going back even earlier.
Okay, Adolph, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I want everyone to hear what you're saying. Danny, I think maybe if you turn your sound down. Maybe
that's what I'm going to do right now.
Sorry about this, everyone at home, but sometimes this is what Skype happens. Okay, go ahead, Adolph.
Okay, I'll give it another shot.
No, it's clean now. It's good.
Okay. I guess I was saying that one of the problems. Well, I'll go back. That the frustration expressed by the student at Morgan, I think, is among other things reflective of the fact that over the last 30 years, our notion of effective political participation has been increasingly shriveled down to voting, which is the most passive form of participation that there is. That's part of the problem. But taking that, in concert, I guess, taking that point back to the construction of brand Obama, even going back to before the actual presidential campaign, the catch-22 is that, a lot of people who are progressives thought that, let's go back to 07 and early 08, and even into the summer of 08 for a minute. Katrina Vanden Heuvel comes to mind, and others. But one of the lines that we got, to people who said, look, it can make sense to vote for Obama as we always vote for Democrats as the lesser of two evils, right? And with the understanding that what the Democrats have had to offer us for more than 20 years now is basically that the other guy's worse. And we can vote for him, and we can even use the campaign as a way to do a little bit of political education, or as much political education as you can do during the tight frame of reference of an election campaign, and say to people, there's not a whole lot there, he's not that much, but the other guy's worse. Well, but what happened instead was people, and I think a lot of people who probably should have known better, allowed themselves to get swept up in the hype. And this was true of a lot of my friends in the labor movement too. But then what happens? Well, the rationale becomes, look, he's only going to be as good as the movement that brings pressure to, that puts pressure on him from underneath. True enough. That's been true of FDR. It's been true of Kennedy. Frankly, a friend of mine used to point out that labor and progressives actually got more from Richard Nixon than we got from Bill Clinton. And that's certainly not because Richard Nixon cared about us or cared about the things that we care about. It's because our movements had the social force to force him to do stuff like OSHA and affirmative action. But with Obama, what happened was that they kind of worked the movement imagery in a very useful way for the administration and a very useless way for the rest of us, which was to say, to sell his campaign as a movement. Now, at the same moment then that we have progressives, giving the son of, almost Mooney-like, stories about how, I wasn't really excited about this guy until I went home and saw my 16-year-old daughter, who had never been politically active, all jacked up, energized, and then I started to pay attention to him, and I realized that he could be Jesus, right? I mean, there was a lot of that stuff going on. So what happens then is we get what are conflicting stories, right? One is, he's a progressive. He'll be as good as we can help him be. Don't push him about anything now. We got to get him elected, and then once we get him elected, we can bring pressure.
Let's go back to Danny's question. Danny, are you hearing me now? Because I know you had to turn your sound down.
Yeah, I turned my sound down. I can hear you.
Okay,
can you hear me?
Danny, the question both of you have raised, where's the movement? So let me ask you, what do you think? Last time there was a really big movement in the United States, it was ignited by African American leadership and African American people and the civil rights movement, and that helped ignite the whole movement in the 1960s, the anti-war movement, and other motions in the society. Where is it now? You're saying we need it, so where is it? What are the obstacles to it?
There are two things that have happened, I believe. The absence of any ideological debate, the acceptance of this one form of relationship, and that is capitalism. That's the first thing that certainly, even with the dark days of the moments of the McCarthyism, which essentially eviscerated any kind of discussion around war and poverty. All those were on the table right there. I mean, even Kennedy, Robert Kennedy was a forceful voice, became a forceful voice, and transformed by what he saw and the experience he had as people like Harry Belafonte and Dr. King began to show them the drastic aspects of American poverty and racism. So on the one hand, you had incredible voices. So the civil rights movement, which is a continuum for our humanity, from the slavery on, the civil rights movement has many other voices. Young people, the radical voices from SNCC, which evolved into other voices that led to the movement for self-defense, the party, and other radical movements. And the discussion also, what was happening also, even within the context of our own experience, there were other experiences that were on at the time. The movement for African liberation, decolonization, and all those particular happening simultaneously. So there's a different kind of discourse and this discussion that was happening at this particular time. The civil rights movement, of course, took a very definitive role, played a very definitive role in the building other movements, the movement for women's rights, et cetera. But also, you saw this extraordinary moment where people would begin to think more, discuss differently. The level of dialogue and intellect was different, and basically the challenge in various ways, the system itself. Now, I would have to believe that there's certain other things that are happening, which I think beyond off our radar screen. As we look at, and many have discussed it, that first of all, what is considered the golden years of U.S. capitalism, and we're 1945 for the next 30 years. And basically, it was able to accept a great deal, a discourse and a great deal that happened that happened at that particular point in time. But you move out of the war to, and the strong voices of peace, and strong voices, anti-fascist voices, et cetera, all these things, labor movement, labor discourse within labor, and all this. And I believe after, probably our last moment was Jesse's campaign. Jesse's first campaign. His first campaign, when progressives came together after the collapse of the Black Panther Party, of the Civil Rights Movement, the end of that, the repressiveness, the radical movements, Black Panther Party, etc., and all the other kind of radical movements. And that last moment of Jesse's first campaign brought progressives together in a different kind of way, brought people together
Right.
in a different kind of way. We're now talking about 26 years ago. Damn near 30 years ago that we were talking about that. So in a sense, we watched at the same time what is happening economically is if people see the financialization of the economy, the outsourced jobs, the opening up, the movement of capital and the restrictions of all those restrictions of labor, all those things begin to take place. And I think, and also King warned us as he talked about the three things in his last book. Where do we go here from humanity of chaos? He talked about war, he talked about militarism, materialism, and racism, and particularly about materialism. And I think the new economy with that financialization, the new economy with the growing technology, particular point where essentially our sense of myself was conducted as a consumer. And therefore, a great deal of things in which we were able to kind of just dispense with that particular sense. The lack of movement is because of our, remember, even as a child in the 60s, the one thing that we attempted to do was abandon the ideas of consumption, and the ideas of the American dream, etc.
Adolph, we all know the statistics. Nobody is being affected by the economic crisis more drastically than the African American community, particularly young African Americans living in big cities. Unemployment might be 30, 40, in some places even 50%. I mean, is there going to be a movement without, to what extent is this issue in terms of helping people understand what's happening to them and what can they do about it? I mean, is there going to be any movement without answering those two questions for young African Americans?
Well, if you can pardon like a narcissistic moment for a shameless plug, right? That the book I'm trying desperately to finish now is called "A Lesson of Obama Mania," and the subtitle is "There's no substitute for an anti-capitalist left." And I think that what's happened to us over the last 3 decades. Well, look, I assume Danny and I both are products of the social movements of the '60s, and we won a lot, but I think one of the things we haven't paid as much attention to is the terms on which we won a lot of what we won, right? I mean, there's a gradual kind of separating of an agenda of economic redistribution and a class critique of capitalism from a rhetoric of multiculturalism and diversity. I just saw that Credit Suisse just got a diversity award from somebody, right? And I mean, the fact of the matter is, right, like from this perspective, you can have a society in which 1% of the population owns 90% of the stuff. And as long as 12% of that 1% is black, half of it's women, 12, 13% are Latinos, and whatever the appropriate percentages are, LBGT or whatever, then by that standard, it's an equal and a just society. Well, that's what's happened is that we've slowly and insidiously, for reasons that are really complex and that no individuals are culpable for more than others anyway. Or, well, I take that back. Some are, but we've evolved from that high period, right, of the late 1960s when the social state of that was first won from struggles from below and the New Deal was extended, right, the other large other segments of the population. We've evolved from that to a notion of justice and equality that's completely consistent with neoliberalism.
Adolph, we're going to take a call from a caller now.
Sure.
Jicky in Washington. Jicky, are you with us? Hello, Jicky.
Hello, Danny, and hello, Adolph. I just wanted to ask a question on behalf of all the Black community who were so exhilarated in Washington when Obama was inaugurated into office. And obviously, some of that support and exhilaration has waned off. And I was wondering, as two Black intellectuals in this country, yourselves and also Cornel West, who from the very beginning has had some celebration, but with that celebration also came some reservation how you now feel about this administration and how it is actually servicing the needs of the black communities in this country, including places like Baltimore, New Orleans, and where there are other concentration of black communities that are really suffering in this economic climate.
All right, Adolph, you want to go first, and then Danny?
Sure. I'll say two things. One is, I'm often reminded of a story my father told me. My father was at Normandy and was the Battle of the Bulge, and he never wanted to be there. But he was also part of FDR's Prisoners of Peace program, where he got stuck in Belgium when the war was over. And he said he was in a theater in Belgium watching a newsreel thing we used to have in the movies. Maybe some of the older people can remember that. I can for sure. On the day after, or shortly after FDR died, and they were doing the man in the street thing that they used to do. And he said that they interviewed a black woman who was obviously going downtown to work in some white woman's kitchen. And the first that she heard of FDR having died was when the reporter told her and asked her what she thought of it. And my father said that she fell on her knees and cried and said, "Oh, Lord, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And he said he sat there in the theater and thought, well, yeah, I know what you're going to do. You're going to get up off your knees and go down and clean out white woman's kitchen like you did yesterday, like you're going to do tomorrow. My point is that these moments of extraordinary identification, right, do two things, right? One is, yes, it's very difficult. I live in Philadelphia, and I drive through West Philadelphia to get to work, and it's very difficult not to get caught up. And in fact, it's impossible not to get caught up in the enthusiasm and the excitement that poor and working black Americans and other black Americans and a whole lot of other people too had on election day in '08. The other side of that coin, though, is that a lot of history happens, or a lot of insight, or what looks like insight, comes just from being in the right place at the right time. And I just happen to live in South Shore, in the 39th State Senate District in Chicago, and was active in the politics of that district and the race when Obama first appeared in 1995. So I've gotten to watch the development of this brand from the very beginning. There was never any reason for anybody who paid attention to assume that Barack Obama was ever going to be anything other than what he is. He was always a neoliberal confection. He was always in the hip pockets of the financial sector. And he always had this nice game of his one trick actually was being able to present himself quite movingly and persuasively as the bearers of everybody's interest, with this promise of transcending all of the contradictions and bringing everybody together. Well, that's a game that works only when you're campaigning for the next office up. He got himself to the next office up. From the moment that he first nailed down the nomination, I'm sure the caller may recall as well, he made this breathtaking turn right, in the week and a half after he had locked up the nomination, which was a harbinger of things to come. Then when he went, he got more Wall Street money in campaign donations than anybody else in the race, and they weren't really doing that because they just loved the idea of there being a black president, and his first appointments after he won were to give the economy to the people who had produced the Wall Street bubble in the first place. So now we're all in the position. I said this in my first comment, right? Like those of us who encouraged, this enthusiasm for a variety of reasons, are now in the position of having to explain to people, and this is especially difficult for those who have actual constituents, whom they encourage to mobilize on Obama's behalf, to go back to them and say either I was wrong, in which case you're inept, or I lied, in which case if they can vote you out of office, they'll vote you out of office. But, there's a kind of penny-wise and pound-foolish aspect to this. Right. And look, I understand how people get caught up in stuff, but, right. As a short answer goes, I don't think there's anything to say to people now except, this is another neoliberal Democratic administration.
So, Danny, the question that had been posed by the caller was it's sort of assessing whether or not the administration had done anything for especially the African American poor in the big cities. And he, when Obama was elected, he made kind of a point that I'm everybody's president. I'm not going to, be a president for blacks. And I think I interviewed a lot of black voters and others at the time, and they said, well, he's got to say this because he's got to get elected. But once he gets elected, he's going to be there for us. I mean, you do a lot of traveling, Danny. You're in a lot of cities. I know you're on picket lines and you're in schools with the Algebra Project, and you talk to a lot of people. What are you hearing now from ordinary people? Not just in the black community, because I mean you're involved with working people in all kinds of communities.
Well, I mean, every sector, whether it's those many of those unions which supported Obama, sent workers out to campaign on his behalf, spent large sums of money on his behalf. For all those, they all express a great deal of disappointment. But the disappointment is housed in such a way in which they still concede to some degree that it's possible, or concede to some degree, it's possible to retain or extract something from the system itself, and while at the same time, where jobs are being exported, or where the real workers remain stagnant, whatever, there seems to be this appetite, mainly to believe that there's something good could come out of.
But don't the unions have to start? Danny, don't
function under.
Don't the unions?
And as long as we be able to get to accept that, and particularly African Americans who, in some sense, and I think abandon their historic moral positioning, African Americans, we're going to accept that, and certainly, I think to that degree, that's what I don't hear that. I don't hear that in people's voices. I don't hear that we wanted to never happen and had no possibility of happening, and we have to do something.
Thanks very much for joining us, Danny.
Okay.
And Adolph, I think we lost, so we'll have to thank Adolph.
I'm here.
You're there. We lost your picture. Thanks very much for joining, Adolph. Thanks very much for joining us, Danny, and we'll continue this conversation in a few weeks.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And if you want to donate, you know where the donate button is. If you want to make a phone call, you call 888-449-6772. Join us in just a few minutes, as we announced earlier, but now we are going to do it. Jesse Frieston's going to join us and talk about his work in Honduras. Please join us in a few seconds back on the Real News Network.